Okay, well, I think we're ready to go. It's 10:30. Welcome everyone to the Insights into the Future plenary. Well, I don't think it's a plenary session, it's a session anyway. My name's Dr. Matilda Aspinall and I'm from London College of Fashion. We have there's four of us speaking today. That's Alessandra Vaccari. Forgive my appalling language pronunciations. Claire Elliott.
Yes.
And Bernadette Casey, who I don't believe is with us just yet. So first of all, I am the first person speaking, so I might as well just start now. So I'm just going to share my screen. Whoops, oh God, just clicked on the wrong thing. My desktop. And here we go. Sorry, I'm just trying to, okay, back to the future of fashion past, refashioning future garment making. Like I said, I'm Dr. Matilda Aspinall from London College of Fashion. So today I shall be presenting the research investigated for my doctorate, which I completed last year. It was a practice-led PhD, and like most research projects, began with a specific objective. However, as the work progressed, my aims and objectives shifted. This presentation is a very condensed synopsis of that research, from product to a pedagogic process. As many museum curators and those working with extant garments will testify, such clothing is rarely to be found in perfect condition. Owing to the shifting value of clothing, both economically and culturally, many items of historic dress has been repaired, modified, altered, with some garments even being unpicked and refashioned. This research focused specifically on refashioned items of historic dress, as when examining such garments, the workmanship often demonstrated a creativity that did not necessarily rely on skill, but showed an ingenuity in the reuse of fabric. By conducting a thorough object-based analysis on refashioned items of historic dress, my practice-led investigation began by questioning whether refashioning skills previously used to prolong the life of garments could be applied in a contemporary context as a sustainable design methodology. Could a solution be found to the growing expanse of unwanted clothing waste by investigating ways in which our predecessors refashioned their clothing? My aim was to explore the viability of introducing some of these techniques into today's clothing system as a means of prolonging the life of contemporary redundant garments. Initially, I intended to create a product that could be developed for industry. However, as the research progressed, the actual process of refashioning became increasingly relevant. As the investigation moved forward, it became clear that my developing methodology had the long-term potential to the education of future fashion makers. So I began by investigating historical refashioning skills through 3 case studies. These historical garments acted as agents to inform the practice. The case studies were process stories. 3 extant garments were analysed. This is me analysing one of the garments I used for a case study. And refashioning techniques relevant to today's clothing culture were identified and realised into 4 contemporary garments. This was achieved by applying Jules Prown's 1982 material culture methodology to analyse 3 historical garments. The methodology suited this study because Prown argues that style is inescapably culturally expressive and that the knowledge embodied in objects is valuable cultural evidence. Specifically, the methodology allows not only for an intellectual participation, but also that the analyst engages with the object on a subjective level. relevant, as when analysing refashioned historical garments, it's impossible to ascertain with any certainty why a garment was refashioned. Additionally, it is a sequential method focusing on the materiality of the object, and one can only analyse the evidence and speculate. Utilising evidence from the analysis, 4 contemporary garments were constructed. The investigation uncovered narratives of refashioning techniques and skills which demonstrated the ingenuity and resourcefulness of past makers. Okay, case study number 1, Mrs. Guinea's gown, located in the archives of the Museum of London, originally constructed in the 18th century, twice refashioned in the 19th century. With each generation, the appearance of Mrs. Guinea's dress was altered, corresponding with the changes in fashion. The future garments that lay dormant in the dress were not predetermined, but as with many historic garments, there was an implicit assumption that it would be refashioned or repurposed. So this was a very interesting case study. It was it is in the Museum of London, and it currently looks like an 1880s princess line dress, which you can see on the right hand side of the screen. However, my research analysis and using the documentation in the Museum of London, it was originally constructed in the 18th century for Queen Charlotte, who then gave it to the relative of Mrs. Guinea, who adapted it to refit herself. Due to its provenance and the quality of the workmanship and the expense of the silk, she then passed the garment on to her daughter, who refashioned it in the 1840s, who then passed it on to her son's wife, who then refashioned it as it is today, which is in it's an 1880s gown. For my creative practice, in this case study, instead of refashioning a garment already in existence, I would construct an entirely new garment. So what was I going to get from, what techniques did I get from analysing this garment? Well, lots of refashioning techniques were done, but overall, the reuse of fabric, it was a reuse of fabric. They decided that the fabric could be reused. So I decided to construct an entirely new garment. Embedded within it would be another preconceived design ready to be released and refashioned. By unpicking the seams of the original garment, the embedded design could be accessed and constructed by laying a paper pattern on the unpicked fabric of the dress. The fabric for the second garment could be cut out and constructed in the manner of home dressmaking. So what did I get from it? I was going to create a garment that, like this one, was designed to be refashioned. So here we have the beginning of my process. Lots of patterns were made. So contemporary garment 1 was designed to be refashioned and constructed for a prolonged life. Contemporary techniques were incorporated, digital print, there's me in my workspace. And the realization. I constructed a garment that was designed to be reconstructed into another. And I had this fantasy that I would create this garment, which I did here, and embedded within it would be maybe a QR code or a digital code. So at some point, the wearer could then scan that code, download a pattern, then recreate it into garment 2. So that was my idea behind this one. From the techniques I extracted from the historical dress was to recreate another garment that had embedded within it the second garment. With each case study, the analysis of the historic garment, along with my ensuing practice, demonstrated that the actual process of refashioning was increasingly relevant. So this is my second case study, forgive my appalling French accent, the Doyen Poinçon, named after the person who donated the garments to the museum. The doyen pinceau is an 18th century men's court coat refashioned into a 19th century women's jaquette. The garment is in the archives of the Palais Galliera. This was a beautiful garment, which they kindly let me look at, which was 18th century men's court coat refashioned into this jaquette. So using techniques extracted from the analysis, from analysing the 19th century jaquette in great depth, I looked at techniques which were used and I applied this to refashioning an officer's #1 military coat. There's many reasons why I chose this. It's all in my PhD if you want to read it. So I virtually unpicked it and reconstructed using tailoring techniques. The decorative embroidery of the doyen pinceau was reinterpreted using digital embroidery and laser cutting for embellishment. So here it is, the reinterpretation of the doyen pinceau by extracting refashioning techniques. I applied those techniques to a redundant army officer's coat that was just sitting around doing nothing. Okay, so my third and final case study was a make-do men garment given by Mr. Barton to Worthing Museum. It was constructed during World War II. And from my analysis of the garment, I speculated that all the materials used to construct the garment were repurposed from elsewhere. Everything constructing this dress was repurposed. From the embroidered inserts, which came from either a curtain or a bed hanging, to the wool constructing other parts of the dress from a RAF uniform, possibly, probably. And even the shoulder padding was upholstery wadding. So everything creating this dress was repurposed. So for this case study, an existing garment created by my Dutch grandmother prior to the outbreak of World War II was refashioned using extracted techniques from the make-do and men garment. Also, I decided to incorporate refashioning techniques promoted by the make-do and men scheme. So this garment belonged to my grandmother, constructed around about the same time as the make-do and men garment. And it had been hanging around for ages in my house. No one wanted to throw it away because it belonged to my granny. And so I thought for the purpose of this research, it would be very interesting to update it and refashion it using these techniques. It was in terrible condition. I had to unravel loads of the wool, which I then redarned, recrocheted. And to give it more of a contemporary twist, I redyed some of the wool and embellished the dress. As the dress was a bit boring, I thought on its own, I created a jacket using a pattern from the 1930s to complement it, really. So here is the process of, I used a patchwork technique, and because that was very popular during World War II. And because the whole garment was going to be made out of materials, waste materials, like the make-do men garment, I created a patchwork out of used colour catchers. Now, not many people, well, people do know what they are. These are kind of things you put in your washing machine to catch colour on. And I'm a bit fussy about my clothes getting dyed by other clothes, colour run. So I've been using these for a time to wash my clothes, my children's clothes. But because I felt so guilty about the waste, I'd started saving them because I thought I'll do something with those at some point. Anyway, I did. So they became the jacket. And I also used the unraveled wool to embellish it, as you can see around the edge. So here is the realization. The recrocheted dress with the colour catcher jacket. All the techniques I used were extracted from the make-do and men dress. So with each case study, the analysis of historic garments, along with my ensuing practice, demonstrated that the actual process of refashioning was increasingly relevant. For example, case study 3 began with an examination of repurposing skills and strategies using techniques gleaned from the analysis of the make-do and men garment. The process was not only an exercise in adapting my technical knowledge to work with the materials at hand, but an act of self-discipline to relinquish envisaged predetermined outcomes. The construction of the jacket and the refashioning of the dress was constrained by the self-imposed prohibition of buying anything new. And the constraint forced me to create inventive solutions like the dyeing, unraveling, using color catchers. So it was a very interesting process. Increasingly, as my research progressed, it appeared that the actual process of refashioning could be developed as a pedagogic practice. Whilst each of my case studies took many months to complete, I developed a simplified methodology, which I tested and evaluated through a series of workshops with postgraduate students from London College of Fashion. Here they are analysing the Victorian garment that I brought in. In the workshops, 3 two-hour sessions, the students were given the opportunity to analyse a refashioned Victorian garment. Using my developed methodology, the garment was examined, refashioned, and collaboratively, the students interpreted the techniques on their own redundant waist garments. So here you can see what they were doing. This was a really great workshop, actually. The workshops established that this practice-led research could be used as a platform from which future fashion innovators can be inspired by neglected waste-saving practices of garment construction. The practice-led research established that historical refashioning techniques can be interpreted and developed for use within the craft of present-day garment construction as a provision for sustaining and prolonging the life of redundant or surplus clothing. The research ascertained that in an educational setting, the study of historical refashioning techniques can introduce future fashion makers to alternative modes of clothing design and construction, past construction techniques and skills, including historical methods of pattern cutting, dress and textile history, the validity of the dress archive, collaborative and creative uses of working with redundant and surplus clothing. The workshop participants left with not merely a comprehension of the refashioning techniques applied by past makers to repurpose valued materials, but an understanding of an aspect of dress history, material culture, and the value of the archive. So, in our current climate crisis, alliteration there, reducing carbon emissions is crucial. And for a concerned generation, research of this type could contribute to their future. Thank you very much, and please get in contact with me if you wish to see my bibliography. Thank you. Right, okay, so next on board is, sorry, let me flip over my page. Claire, would you like to speak now, Claire?
Yes, I put my video and I just share my screen. I would like to ask if it's possible to do that in French. I see in all the participants a lot of French people, so if it's convenient for you, it will be comfortable for me. So
Claire,
if it's okay.
Claire, I'm fine with it. If you feel more comfortable speaking in French, that's the most important thing. And your slides are in English, so we'll get the gist. Okay, so there you go. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, you see my screen. Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran? Okay.
Perhaps you could make it a bit bigger for us because we've just got half your screen. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Donc, je vais vous présenter mon projet, mon sujet qui est les matériaux souples, réactifs, redéfinissant notre relation avec les outils numériques. Je suis Claire Elliot, je viens du Centre de recherche interdisciplinaire à Paris. Je suis designer et chercheur et spécialiste en e-textile. Alors, je préfère le terme de matériaux souples plutôt que e-textile, mais c'est beaucoup plus parlant e-textile, donc électronique textile, que de parler de matériaux souples réactifs, même si je pense que par rapport à mon étude, c'est beaucoup plus cohérent et pertinent de parler de matériaux souples parce que ça englobe tous les matériaux. Donc, je travaille sur justement l'adéquation entre les systèmes électroniques. Donc, on va parler aussi de embedded system, système embarqué, dans le textile ou à l'extérieur du textile, mais cette connexion entre les matériaux souples et les systèmes électroniques. Donc, voici le sommaire qui compte 4 phases. Qui correspond à mon full texte. Donc, le premier, c'est la mode comme une interface à la relation au monde. On va voir comment la mode a un impact sur les outils numériques. Le deuxième, c'est sur le fait que les e-textiles, tout ce qui est textile électronique, change le paradigme lié aux objets digitaux. Ensuite, la méthodologie, comment l'interdisciplinarité va jouer un rôle important sur la reconstruction de ces systèmes. Et en dernier, comment on modélise des systèmes. Alors, j'ai voulu faire un jeu de mots entre mode et modélisation. En reprenant le mot mode, mais ça ne marche pas en anglais, donc j'ai écrit modeling of new systems, ce qui veut dire réinjecter la pensée de la mode dans les outils numériques. Donc, en première phase, la mode comme une interface à notre relation avec les nouveaux outils numériques. J'ai pris cette image du dernier défilé d'Isabelle Marant avec la Horde qui représente bien pour moi le fait que la mode, c'est vraiment, outre le vêtement, quelque chose qui nous met en contact, qui nous met en relation avec notre environnement et qui fait corps. Et cette importance de faire corps avec le corps et corps avec notre environnement, qui fait que c'est le système le plus proche qu'on a de tous nos objets environnementaux. Donc, comment ce vêtement et la pensée de la mode fait ce lien entre notre corps et notre environnement et sa place d'interface, en fait, très... qui est inhérente en fait à l'humain. Et le fait que le matériau flexible est un médium dans notre relation sensible avec le monde. Donc, j'insisterai sur cette question de sensibilité. Comment est-ce que le textile va être ce matériau sensible, ce lien en fait avec le sensible. J'ai beaucoup aimé la phrase de Nathalie Crasset pour l'Académie des savoir-faire Hermès en conférence. Elle disait « Les tissus sont des médiateurs d'humanité, ils relient la matière au vivant ». Donc, c'est sur cette question que la mode a ce rôle de relier la matière au vivant. Et donc, la mode au sens global et pas juste le vêtement. Et c'est ce dépassement du vêtement que je veux montrer. Donc, de l'interface textile à l'interface connectée, comment on passe avec les nouvelles technologies d'une autre forme d'interface, parce qu'on a déjà cette interface de communication qui est liée à la mode, et comment est-ce que les nouveaux dispositifs vont nous créer de nouvelles formes d'interface qui est liée à des outils de communication. Donc, pour le moment, dans la mode vraiment pure, on va voir en fait des projets qui sont assez expérimentaux où on va intégrer les nouvelles technologies de manière à créer un support. Le vêtement devient support à des nouvelles technologies et ce qui transforme en fait les technologies en système d'apparat, donc en décor, et non forcément pour son usage et sa capacité à créer de nouvelles interfaces. Donc, voilà des exemples. Je me donne en propre exemple parce que j'ai eu ce moment, en fait, de prendre la technologie comme support parce que c'était un territoire d'expérimentation intéressant et de se dire on va utiliser le vêtement, on va utiliser la mode pour démontrer une technologie et pour montrer cette capacité à créer une relation entre l'environnement et les nouvelles technologies qui est plus proche du corps et l'utiliser comme un système d'apparat et pour son esthétique, donc notamment la LED ou les panneaux solaires qu'on voit sur le projet de Pauline Van Dongen, du coup qui vont faire partie prenante d'une esthétique qui va justement à l'encontre des codes aussi de la mode. Donc comment est-ce que ce dialogue est compliqué et il y a une tension entre les nouvelles technologies et la mode à cause de ça, à cause du fait que les scientifiques vont prendre le dispositif, le dispositif textile, donc le vêtement, comme juste support, et la mode va prendre les nouvelles technologies comme juste manière de créer de l'apparat, mais sans aller plus profondément dans la recherche même de l'adéquation de ce système. Donc, pour moi, le concept de soft reactive matter, donc là, ça marche bien en anglais, c'est créer des matériaux sous-réactifs, donc réactifs à son environnement et qui va créer ce lien manquant, en fait, entre nous et l'environnement. Et le fait que nos objets numériques actuels, ce soient juste des boîtes noires, telles des téléphones portables, des tablettes, des ordinateurs, et comment on reconsidère les objets grâce aux matériaux souples. Donc, la définition pour moi, ce sont des textiles du coup qui sont connectés aux matériaux. Il y a 3 phases de connexion à faire. La première, c'est le fait qu'on relie la matière à un système technologique. Donc, on crée un lien entre le dispositif électronique et le textile ou le matériau souple. Le deuxième, c'est on va essayer de l'intégrer, donc le mettre à l'intérieur du matériau, essayer de le camoufler et de correspondre le plus possible aux propriétés du textile, c'est-à-dire la flexibilité, la transparence. Et la troisième phase, celle qui va ouvrir le champ des possibles, c'est le matériau qui devient un capteur. Et du coup, comment on transforme, grâce aux propriétés du textile, le matériau pour qu'il devienne un capteur. Pour éviter justement l'image que vous voyez là de body avec 50 câbles qui sont branchés et cette complexité en fait qui est reliée au fait que les systèmes ne sont pas organiques. Et donc, comment est-ce qu'on va lier ces composants solides à des composants souples? On voit par l'image juste à côté un des derniers projets du MIT montrant en fait c'est à peu près le même projet qui est de chaque côté, sauf que le chercheur a réussi à tisser les capteurs directement dans la maille et il y a juste le boîtier qui renferme la batterie et le microcontrôleur. Donc, il y a cette question d'adapter au support si on veut créer des nouvelles fonctionnalités grâce au textile connecté. Comment est-ce qu'on dématérialise les systèmes pour les rematérialiser ensuite? Et du coup, on va essayer de faire une transposition entre les systèmes solides existants et ceux qui peuvent devenir souples. Par exemple, vous voyez sur le côté un projet de Wei Sheishi qui intègre, lui, les LED en brodant, en utilisant le point de croix. Donc, comment les techniques aussi de la couture et de la mode vont aider à cette intégration. Et d'un autre côté, des expériences que j'ai fait de sérigraphie de capteurs directement avec de l'encre conductrice sur du cuir pour essayer justement de correspondre le plus possible, de faire correspondre ces systèmes électroniques à des produits de mode. Donc, ma problématique, c'est mais qu'en est-il réellement de la place de la matière dans nos objets numériques actuels? Parce que justement, ces boîtes noires dont je parle, qui sont les téléphones, les tablettes, les ordinateurs, sont inertes, sont insensibles. Et le fait de réinjecter de la mode, pardon.
5 minutes left, Claire.
Okay.
5 minutes.
OK. L'intégration de ces... Comment, du coup, on transforme ces boîtes noires par l'intégration de ces systèmes. Et donc, l'interdisciplinarité est la méthode qui va permettre de faire de la recherche sur ces projets, qui est très en amont de l'application même d'intégrer juste des systèmes électroniques au textile, qui va mélanger ces 4 compétences qui sont le design textile, le produit, l'interaction et la programmation hardware. Donc, je passe très vite sur la méthode de recherche que j'ai mis en place, qui est liée à l'analyse et l'adaptation et qui met le prototype au centre, où le fait de mettre le prototype au centre du projet va permettre de se poser toutes ces questions d'adéquation, d'adaptation du système électronique à d'autres utilisations et de l'intégrer de manière à concurrencer nos boîtes noires. Donc, qui est lié aussi à un circuit qui va être le détournement, la déconstruction et la reconstruction. Donc, mon travail est très lié à la méthode du reverse engineering, donc rétro-ingénierie en français, qui va être de déconstruire des objets existants, les comprendre pour pouvoir les adapter et faire des recherches sur les composants mêmes. Donc là, par exemple, c'est une image de bobine où je voulais faire des haut-parleurs et voir en fait quel impact avait la forme, le matériau par rapport à la fonction. Donc, la mode, c'est vraiment la manière de modéliser de nouveaux systèmes. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on réinjecte cette notion de mode qui n'est pas juste le fait d'être lié aux vêtements, mais qui va au niveau des systèmes connectés actuels, va me permettre de les repenser entièrement. Donc, à la fois de réinjecter l'aspect sensible qui est lié à nos objets qui sont autres que nos objets technologiques, leur matérialité, quel lien on fait avec ça, leur sens, quel sens ils ont pour nous et comment repenser en fait les usages. Et cet outil de communication où on a déjà la mode comme outil de communication qui est très puissant. Et du coup, comment, avec des outils de communication technologiques, on va réinjecter un outil de communication sensible. Donc là, c'est le finaliste de hier qui est c'est un exemple que j'aime beaucoup parce qu'on voit en fait le finaliste de hier qui est un Belge qui s'appelle Vitidi, qui vraiment intègre la matérialité dans son projet. On le voit avec les couleurs, les différents matériaux qui sont agglomérés et je trouvais que c'était une image très parlante pour reparler de mode. Donc, on va créer justement, dans ce processus, c'est la création d'interfaces haptiques. Comment est-ce qu'on va créer des interfaces sensibles au niveau du matériau et qu'on n'est pas justement que sur des écrans lisses et froids. C'est un projet en collaboration avec Marion Voileau qui s'appelle Learning Matter, sur lequel on a travaillé justement sur cette question de réintégrer la matérialité et de transformer le capteur afin de pouvoir avoir un capteur souple, avoir un capteur sensible. Et du coup, on a créé à l'issue de ça des systèmes pour les enfants en école maternelle pour leur redonner en fait de la sensibilité sur leur interaction numérique pour justement déroger au fait que les systèmes numériques ne sont pas liés forcément à des écrans et à une relation qui est assez froide avec le système. Il y a aussi le retour haptique, donc, qui va permettre, donc là, il y a 2 exemples que je n'ai pas le temps de décrire, mais je vous invite à aller les regarder, qui vont renvoyer en fait un retour qui n'est pas un retour d'image et un retour de texte, mais on a un retour qui va être sensible. Et du coup, comment on réintègre ce retour sensible qui est présent dans la mode? Je vais finir avec le fait que pour moi, le numérique devrait être repensé en fonction de la mode pour créer en fait cette question d'objet relationnel. Donc l'objet relationnel, c'est à la fois ramener de la communication et de l'expérience utilisateur par cette rematérialité, par cette connexion avec le monde et repenser cette connexion avec le monde, pas juste l'utilisation qu'on a d'un objet. Reconnecter à cette matérialité, donc réintégrer des matériaux qui vont être sensibles, repenser justement tout ce qu'on a comme matériaux textiles avec des propriétés récentes pour les réintégrer et établir une relation émotionnelle avec l'objet, ce qui se perd beaucoup, c'est-à-dire que le smartphone, finalement, on n'a pas de relation émotionnelle à part ce qu'il contient dedans, mais on n'a pas de relation d'émotion qui est reliée à l'objet même, à sa physicalité. Donc, mon projet Soft Mirror est un projet manifeste qui démontre en fait ce qui est un objet relationnel, c'est-à-dire qu'il va recréer une relation différente que les relations qu'on a avec les écrans. Donc, c'est une forme d'écran souple, motorisé, qui va bouger en fonction de nos déplacements et en fonction d'un téléphone. Le téléphone, finalement, n'est que l'objet de contrôle et n'est pas un objet avec lequel on interagit directement. L'interaction, là, elle est en face de cet écran-là. Et du coup, on réintègre cette volumétrie, ce rapport au sensible et ce rapport au corps directement, qui n'est pas un vêtement, mais en tout cas qui va s'appuyer sur ces notions-là, qui est liée au vêtement. J'ai essayé de faire le plus court possible à la fin. J'espère que je ne vais pas trop dépasser. Je vous remercie. Je vous invite à me suivre sur Instagram, sur ResearchGate, où j'ai 2 publications. Mon groupe de recherche a un site qui s'appelle The Motion Lab, si vous voulez voir les projets de mon équipe. Je remercie Marion et Joël de mon équipe de m'avoir aidé et suivi pour ce raisonnement. Si vous avez des questions.
Thank you, Claire. Could you unshare your screen, please?
Yes.
Okay, so our next speaker is Alessandra Vacchiari. Could you come on board, Alessandra? Sorry if my Italian pronunciation is appalling.
No problem. Is the pronunciation?
Okay, I'm going to hand over to you now, Alessandra.
Okay, I would like to share my screen as well. Did you Did you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but it's just the PowerPoint screen.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Alessandra Vaccari, and I work at the in Università UAV di Venezia in Italy, and my research and teaching area are in fashion history and theory. And today I would like to introduce my work on fashion futuring, and the presentation is articulated in 3 main sections. The first section is an overview of the work with a short explanation of the theoretical references. The second deals with the need of overcoming the dualistic conception of fashion, and the third put the theory into practice, experimenting with what we called the what-if approach. So the first section. Fashion is undergoing a process of great transformation, and many questions recur obsessively in the understanding of what will be the future of fashion, especially after the pandemic crisis. The word future is acquiring a relevance in fashion that is perhaps has not had since the 1960s. Then it was associated with the new technology and optimism of space travel, whereas today it comes back via anxiety about the future and the no future discourse of environmentalists and climate change activists. At the same time, the fashion industry discourses about sustainability are revived the word future as a possible way forward for fashion, which can and should play a major role in the creation of a better world. This paper aimed to investigate the story that fashion tells about its imagined future, It intends to identify and analyze the futuring discourses that are emerging as a possible way forward for fashion by taking into account the contact zones between critical thinking in design, environmental activism, and fashion history. The paper draws on the concept of futuring as a paradigm shift in the 21st century fashion. Futuring stems from the work of the design theorist Tony Fry, who has argued for the need of redirecting the current designs, aims, and scopes to better respond to a world that has become unsustainable. Futuring has been firstly adapted to fashion by scholar Alice Payne, who considered the dynamic process able to negotiate between opposite interpretation of sustainability through this concept. This paper also draws on fashion speculative methods, starting from the critical theory approach to design conceived by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, that consider design as a tool to create ideas, stimulate social dreaming, and speculate about possible futures. It draws also on historical and theoretical approaches devoted to uchronic temporalities and alternate futurism, including Professor Caroline Evans and my recent elaboration on the concept of fashion as uchronia. This concept comes from Roland Barthes' The Fashion System. As utopia means no place, according to Barthes, uchronia refers to a time that does not exist, a time that asks, what if? Therefore, uchronia also means imagined times and fictional time. As such, it opens up to many possibilities for innovative thinking and enables progressive narratives. The paper is part of an ongoing research project on the futuring practices that are emerging in fashion in order of achieving desirable futurism, giving new direction to the key themes of ecology, sustainability, and ethics. The purpose of the is to show the significant role that futuring and speculative fictions could play in redirecting fashion and, broadly speaking, in reimagining fashion itself. The research would like to overcome the dominant identification of fashion with its own industry and to open up a different interpretation of inventions, fantasies, and alternate history beyond the promotional and heritage-related purposes of fashion design and communication. By doing so, it aims to challenge the dominant dualistic understanding of fashion as an unrealistic fantasy for a real industry and to point out some possible aims for designers and fashion thinkers. Section 2, the idea of overcoming the dualistic interpretation of fashion. With its propensity to act as a dream machine that creates idealized world and illusory times, fashion has been considered one of the most contradictory aspects of Western culture. Its dreaming and dreamy facade often hides the realities of suffocating factories, precariousness and labor exploitation, and as highlighted by the criticism that Karl Marx expressed against fashion in the 19th century, and that goes all the way to the recent debate on fast fashion, offshore manufacturing, and environmental issues. The delocalization to non-European countries meaningfully symbolize the separation of fashion imaginaries from production, suite, and workers. In her book, Adorned in Dreams, Elizabeth Wilson emphasized the continuous, I quote, confusions between real and not real, end of quotation, and the aesthetic obsession that characterize postmodern fashion. Compared to the 1980s, in which Wilson wrote, fashion as a great collectively shared dream has been fragmented in the 21st century into a multitude of imaginaries conveyed on different scale by fashion communities through platform networks and especially social media. However, the idea of fashion as the combination of dream and aesthetics is still present nowadays and continues to affect the discourses of environmental and social sustainability of fashion. This is what Jose Tonnison defined, I quote, hotism of fashion, and he calls Théophile Gautier's concept of art pour art, the art for art's sake. That is the 19th century idea of the total independence of the artist, whose relative faculties should be free from any moral constraint and political goals. And the third section, the idea of the what if approach. In order to experiment futuring and a speculative method to fashion, this paper and our research relies on what if as a key methodological tool. What if is the question that typically introduces alternate history, and for this reason is at the basis of this approach to uchronic time. The uchronic time of fashion allows one to build fantastic scenarios starting from real facts and characters. It is like an invented time, but with real repercussions. From the point of view of speculative narratives, criticism and social change are the motivation underlying the uchronic process, as in the case of the action strategies of activist groups and radical environmental movement. To make an example of this what if approach, we can ask, what if Africa were the richest continent in the world? This idea was behind a provocative advertising campaign launched by Diesel Fashion Company in 2001, featuring this fictional newspaper, The Daily Life, you can see in the picture, in which Black models lounge in limousines or luxury offices under headlines such as, I quote from this fictional newspaper, African expedition to explore unknown Europe by foot, imaging Africa's supremacy as a world power. What if was, in our case, in my university, what if was a series of collaborative conversation and a workshop with our master student carried out in summer 2020 in the frame of the above-mentioned fashion futuring research project. I was a co-facilitator of What If together with fashion designer Professor Fabio Quaranta and research in fashion design Paolo Franzo. In each conversation, we invited two fashion professionals.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. To propose and discuss a topic by asking the students one or more questions, starting with what if. All the conversations were motivated by a certain sense of urgency and worries about the future. Actually, this series was conceived during the most critical months of the COVID-19 pandemic, which raised new old questions about possible future of fashion and revealed the great weaknesses of fashion in terms of places of production, timing, schedule, and the role of the fashion designers. Starting from the question, what if, was a way to ask not only what the fashion of the future will be, but also what the future fashion can contribute to build. What happens when fashions begin to invent stories for good to support desirable rather than unsustainable futurists? And what are the designers doing to change it? The cycle of collaborative conversation involved emerging fashion designer and difference of radical vision of fashion, curator, professional, and expert in environmental sustainability, digital fashion, and artificial intelligence, and so on. Here are the poster of our program. This formula of collaborative conversation required the invited speaker not only to tackle new content, but to do so in order to build a new idea by means of their interaction in the field of education and communication. The collaborative approach requires, in fact, that the speakers discuss with a creative goal rather than a controversial one in order to generate new ideas or deepen their knowledge of a given topic. The collaborative approach reverberated in the contribution to the students themselves who took part to the project. Each conversation stimulated discussion on how fashion should be in front of the great issues of social and environmental sustainability, and in response to the radical changes brought about by technological innovation and the pandemic crisis. So to come to a conclusion, we can say that this experimentation has been carried out in the framework of futuring and speculative method with two aims. The first is contributing to the discourse on the ongoing change of fashion paradigm vis-a-vis to sustainability. The second has to do with fashion historiography. Therefore, the paper shows how uchronic manipulation of time and the reality allows one to radically rethink to the past and moreover contribute to design the future. Because building hypothetical scenarios in the sphere of fashion bears concrete transformative implications. These allow the achievement of two major outcomes. The first is that speaking about fictional history proved to be an effective tool to identify and understand current and actual issues, such as the precarity of fashion designer vis-a-vis artificial intelligence, and the precarity of the real garment vis-a-vis the digital. I refer here to one of the key themes dealt with during the conversation. And the second is the role the speculative fashion play in rethinking the idea of history. For example, finding a counter-history of the European fashion to overcome the narrative of the big brands and the cliche of glamour and beauty. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And last, we have Bernadette Casey. Bernadette? I haven't seen her on our participants list, actually. Bernadette? I'm not sure if she's here, actually. Okay, well, that That's disappointing that she's not here because we cannot open her up to the conversation. Alessandra, could you unshare your screen, please?
Done.
I can still see it, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, perfect. Okay. That's great. Okay, since we haven't got Bernadette, that gives us a bit more time for questions. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions. You may want to put your hand up, or as most people haven't got their photos up, their image up, I can't see you. So maybe put it in the chat. It's very quiet. Well, I'm going to come straight in because I found that talk about the what if methodology absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about it, Alessandra. What were the outcomes of your students? What were the sort of outcomes that came with your students realizing this what if? What kind of futures did they consider or would like to happen? If you could just go into a little bit more detail, because that fascinated me.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. It was very interesting as the student, the output for the student were, we didn't ask any precise output. We freed the student to produce what they like during the workshop and after the workshop. This in term, the student replied with images or short text or some videos. And of course, they also participated to the conversation. And from my point of view, one important aspect of this methodology is the idea of is a kind of a way to putting some funny questions on the table, enable the student to think what is important for them today, in fact. So it's a kind of a method, is something funny and unreal and speculative, but the questions are very sound and very, very real in a sense. So it's a kind of a mix. And we told about the worries about of course how technologies today are fascinating, and the idea of we invited, for instance, there's the person in charge for sustainability at IOX Net-a-Porter, and she worked also with artificial intelligence, and from their point of view, working with artificial intelligence and storing the big data is a kind of a way to also to be more focused, interpreting the desire of the consumers. And interpreting the desire of the consumers is a way to be more sustainable. But of course, this raises a lot of questions about where is in the future, what will be in the future creativity that is a fundamental matter for the student, for the fashion student. And what will be in the future the role of the fashion designer, and also of course we know that this question are question for the future, but there are also very sound in the present.
Thank you very much. I'm really fascinated by this what if. I've just seen a question from Damien. He says, I have one question for Claire and one for Matilda. Could you elaborate on the next step of the prototype process, which is the main issue? how to imagine a future for e-textiles in the field of fashion industry and production scale. I think that's more directed at you, Claire. Maybe it's in, and there's one for you, Claire, in French, which I'm not even going to I'm not even going to try and say it in French. So maybe you could read it out and then I'll answer the question from Damien.
The question is what the next step after prototyping?
Yeah, hello, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. It's better, of course, if you can do it in French and English. I was just asking for the prototype process after the whole thing that you showed. Merci, thank you for everyone for all this very interesting presentation. Oui, j'avais une question, Claire, au sujet de la suite, en fait, de ces prototypes, parce que c'est le grand problème, malheureusement, justement, des e-textiles, c'est après tout un travail vraiment fascinant justement sur cette réflexion autour des textiles intelligents, des textiles e-textiles, comment envisager la suite pour une consommation à plus grande échelle, for consumption on a bigger scale?
Sure. I think for my goal, it's just to create a proof of concept. So the prototype just stop when it demonstrates something. But the question in how to push on the market this kind of things, it's there is a lot of industrial problem. When I see in France, it's the problem to create the communication between industry, electronic industry, and French industry, French textile industry. It's not very compatible because it's not the same way to thinking. So there is a problem of temporality, of duration. So there is a lot of problem in the industry. It's for that the research on this subject are very important to bypass all this industrial problem. So it's for that the part on the question of integration of embedded system into textile or re-evaluation of components. If je vais le faire en français parce que j'ai du mal à m'exprimer dessus. Mais si on arrive à bien intégrer les composants électroniques, on va réussir à changer l'industrie. C'est-à-dire que peut-être que l'industrie de la mode pourra faire ses composants électroniques parce qu'il n'y aura que des matériaux souples. Ça ne nécessitera pas d'être lié à des industries électroniques. Donc, c'est pour ça que pour moi, c'est un pas vers le futur. Et aussi l'apprentissage, to teach to all, to teach to the students in the fashion school or engineering school this field, allowed to have a new kind of project and new thinking on that, and open to a lot of possibility. And after I thinking to teach also at very, very young children in the kindergarten. It's one of my projects I show. It's to integrate this kind of object to young children because it's complicated for industrialized for our generation, but maybe in many years it was possible for next generation. So for me, the researcher like us have to prepare the next generation to change the system of fashion and the system of the actual system of industry. So it's my answer to that.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, there was a question from me, Alessandra. She says, I liked your presentation. Have you? Oh, no, there's two for me. I'll start with the first one. The students were given the opportunity to investigate this Victorian garment that I'd worked with before that had been refashioned. And they were postgraduate students at the London College of Fashion. So all of them, there were 2 pattern cutting students, and I worked with the MA Fashion Futures, and all of them really relished the opportunity to work with a garment and investigate and look closely at this Victorian, refashioned Victorian garment. And the process, the methodology that I have designed takes them through a series of processes, and the outcomes were, I was just testing it to see how it would work with them, and the outcomes were fantastic because they enjoyed, number one, seeing the garment. They loved looking at how the ingenuity of these past makers who actually, the thing is, we deal with such a, clothes are so well constructed. There's a level of perfection now that we have in all our garments. And so, the fact that the stitch marks were still there, they liked the fact that you could see how the garment had been refashioned, and it didn't have to be perfect. So they incorporated all of this into their own work. And it was really, really fun and really successful. And they learned about historic pattern cutting, how people reuse textile waste, and it's just another tool for them to take with them and think about when they go into their design process. And they hadn't been aware of this part of fashion history. And historical pattern cutting gets taught in costume design classes, but not necessarily in fashion design. So it was successful, and I was delighted, and I had a great time teaching them. So I hope that answers your question. And Alessandra. Sorry, she said, Alessandra, do you want to ask me your question in like properly?
I try to better explain my question. I noticed that the fashion magazines in the 18th, but also in the 20th century up to the mid 20th century, frequently published the articles about how to updating the clothes of the past season in the new one. So it's very, so I thought this idea while in connection with your refashioning process. And you told us about this more Jules Prone's method, more how to say, more linked to the materiality of clothes. And I would like to know if you never ever thought to work with the more, I don't know.
Well, you know what? You're so right, because I've looked at lots of texts from the 20s and the 30s, and I've taken it right back to, gosh, in the end of the 19th century. There's some texts where they show you how to reuse children's adult clothing into children's clothing, and obviously during World War II there were lots of patterns published. That's my next stage, because mine was just all about the materiality, but now I think it would be really interesting to catalogue and look at some of those old magazines and texts. There's a lot of manuals on how to make clothes, and then they say, well, you can turn your old skirt into a da-da-da, or a man's jacket into this, that, and the other. And so yes, I really think that would be really interesting for students.
Yes, I think so. It could be a good idea. And also, of course, for the manual, but in our experience, fashion, we are completely, when we think to a fashion magazine, we don't have this experience of mending, of reshaping the clothes. So it's very, I think, powerful to, for even for the students, and to different experience of our new clothes, what new clothes means, and how was important to refashioning in the previous centuries.
And it's also about giving students well, you know, the embedded value of cloth and clothing. You know, it all has value. It's very easy for people because clothing is so cheap to it's disposable, whereas actually, you know, cotton grew, it was made in a factory, there's so much embedded value in clothing, and the refashioning process also gives them the opportunity to kind of A, see how it was constructed, and B, to see the material, the value of that garment. You know, it's not just disposable. The people who made it were very skilled, actually, whether they're in Bangladesh or Myanmar or Sri Lanka, they were very skilled. So it's, yeah, so it's a very interesting area, one that is a branch of sustainability. It's not going to fix, you know, it's just another avenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right.
So do we have any other questions coming through? Because we got quite a lot of time left because of the loss of one of our speakers.
I don't have a question, just a few words for Claire. When you show us the image of the lead with the lead incorporated in this needlework, this kind of needlework, it reminds me the Daniela Rosner's book on critical fabulations, and I think that could be interesting for you. And this is more about design, not fashion, but she worked with yes, very, very feminine kind of needleworks of crochet, and so she mixed the method, mixing technologies and women practices, and I think that could be interesting for you, for your research.
Thank you. Could you just write me the name exactly in the conversation?
Yeah, sure.
Daniela?
It's Daniela Rosner, and the book is Critical Fabulations.
Mm-hmm.
I have just one question, Matilda. I don't know if I can take the speech. You were showing, Matilda, the different dresses and things that you were making, and I was just wondering, when you're using, you know, the square patterns, the rectangular pattern, if it was a relation to the picture that you have behind you of Sonia Delaunay, 1925.
Well spotted. Well, you know what happened is that I knew I was going to do something with these color catchers, and there was a Sonia Delaunay exhibition at the Tate at that time, and I went to see it, and I was like, fantastic. I was completely inspired. I absolutely, it was, you're absolutely right. This is where I work, and this is exactly it. I was like, and yes, I wrote all about that. I was totally blown away by her idea of asymmetry and juxtaposition of colors, and I read all about her way of putting colors together, and I tried to do that. I emulated that.
But just a question: you when you were doing what's it called, like it was not a dress, it was like a skirt. You were showing before in your presentation, full of all this rectangular made for the lingerie. You were stitching them. It was stitched. It was attached. Right.
The jacket or the
jacket, yeah.
Yeah, it was. I used it. It's a kind of paper, and I stitched it with. I stitched it with leftover thread from the previous case study. The metallic thread I used to embellish the jacket. I did it on a machine, but I tacked it first.
Okay. Which is not quite. It's quite different from the way Sonia Delaunay was making her textiles.
It wasn't. It was just an inspiration. I was completely inspired by her way of work. Just the visual.
No, because when I make a connection between Sonia Delaunay and your work. I was like, do you think, is Sonia Delaunay using also patterns stitched? No, it's just printed patterns that she was doing.
Yeah, and she, yes, I just loved it. Also in her exhibition, I've forgotten what it's called now, but she had a child's blanket that she'd patchworked, and she called it, it's all written down somewhere, but I can't think of it. Anyway, she was,
it's the very origin of her work. This is what I was asking you, because she was really stitching patterns based on the Ukrainian and Russian type of patterns that she was doing. It was one of the first things she'd made before making clothing.
Exactly. It was when she, I was I just loved that exhibition, and I loved the way she moved from being a fine artist, textile artist, and then into fashion, and that image there. And it also reminded me, because this image here, which people can't see, because it's not, I mean, this was a really quick overview of my research. I went into a lot of detail while I was remaking my grandmother's dress into her life, and there was a picture of her standing by a car, and that kind of resonated between this Delaunay picture of my grandmother standing by a car, and it was very nuanced, my actual practice, but yes, very much inspired by Sonia Delaunay.
It's a good inspiration.
Yeah, exactly. She's amazing. So do we have any more questions? I have, yes, Alessandra, what if approach was very interesting and mind-opening. I'd like to know, in such imaginary scenarios, we might have the risk of being reductive or politically incorrect with top-down approaches. How can we avoid such risks when we apply such an approach?
Well, thank you for this very dense and interesting question. In my experience, is not really a top-down approach. I don't feel it as a top-down approach. In my experience, was more about a participatory approach. We share our knowledge and we try to build up these fantasies about in part real, about fashion. And I think the main point of the what if approach is in fact reverse the top-down approaches. Fashion industry apply this kind of top-down approaches when they are inventing their own heritage, for instance. The concept of heritage is sometimes not the full real stories of a brand, is a story, but is also a story for our contemporary taste. So it's a kind of a speculative stories, more for commercial purposes than speculative one. So it's a kind of reversing this idea of, it's the idea of heritage, and try to think forward. In the book, I had the opportunity to co-edit with Caroline Evans. We elaborate this idea of uchronic time, and there is a small part of the what if, even if it's not elaborated as an approach as I presented today. But in the text we put together, it is an anthology in time in fashion, this is the title. We put inside a text of Ilaria Vanni, that is an Italian scholar, and she works in Australia, in Sydney. And she worked she wrote a piece on a fictional fashion designer that in 2005 was admitted to participate to the Milan Fashion Show and Milan Fashion Week. And this fictional fashion designer was created by precarious workers in fashion, like a kind of protesting against their precarious condition, their precarious experience of fashion. So all those people was very experienced in communication, and they built it up a biographical profile, an image, Fox magazines, Fox communication, and with all this fake communication, asked to the Camera Nazionale della Moda to be admitted to the Fashion Week. And the Camera Nazionale della Moda say, yes, you could make a show. So this is a good example of what the what if approach could do if in terms of is unreal, the fiction, this fashion designer does not exist, but it could help to change our perception, is a political meaning. So I hope this help to focus this.
This could also be in, in that the idea that diesel commercial, Afrofuturism, I think it's called, that exactly. So the idea of this what if, the Afrofuturism thing. So that is actually bringing to the fore, to that commercially, to the fore, this idea of what if, isn't it? So it's a very useful tool. I think it's a fantastic teaching method, actually. So do we have any, oh, I think,
oh, sorry for misunderstanding your thinking. I just thought, what would it turn out to be? Okay. Thank you.
oh, I see.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
so,
what if it does turn out to be real, that the world gets too hot? God knows what's going to happen. It will turn out to be real if we don't do something about it anyway. Can we have some more questions? Are there any more questions? Otherwise, anyone else want to talk? Okay. I just wanted to ask Claire one more thing. Claire, I love the idea that you were thinking that this is for the really young generation, for the younger children to learn. This will become their normal. That's why you feel you're teaching what we'd call nursery school children here in England. Would you just elaborate a little bit more on how you see that would progress?
I would like to create a project which use the open source system to communicate on this kind of new object, and it's related to the Fab Lab effect. All this new the Fab Lab, this new place, new workshop with numerical tools to create by yourself your project, or repair also object existing on the market. And I do a relationship with this kind of place and a proposition of object to building by themselves. And my idea is to communicate of this kind of object thanks to the open source system, and propose to build other object with textile. So it's my idea, but I think I hope there is other person like me, because it's a big, huge work. But I have begun to work on that with Marion Voileau, which is a PhD in my laboratory. And she worked on the numerical tools for young children. And she creates a platform to communicate on other tools for children, because a lot of parents and educators knows that it's very difficult to don't use a smartphone or computers for young children, and what is the solution for that?
Yes, of course.
To drop all the numerical system. No, it's not a good solution. The solution is to create new objects which are not bad for the health, because the question is, for the very young children, our numerical tools, digital tools are very bad for young children, and it's a big question in this moment, because we see all the worst effects of just now, the worst effect of screen, and we see for us, but also the impact for young children. It's very it's very bad. So it's for that I'm between two questions: the question of educate on new numerical tools and try to diffuse and communicate on this kind of tools, and try to teach for other community and students to work on this kind of problematic, to have a new proposition of object or tools to fight against our new digital tools, actual digital tools.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting, your research. I could ask you so many questions, but we're actually running out of time. We've got 4 minutes left. Does anyone else want to ask a question, or shall I just, we've had some fantastic speaking today. Thank you so much, Alessandra and Claire. We've had some great conversation. So, oh my goodness, I've gone over time. I thought it was still 12. Sorry. Sorry, everybody. It said the session was until 12:45, and I'm looking at English time. So we've actually overrun, not till 12. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And I've just been told that it's okay. Thank you, everybody. And wonderful to meet you all. And I hope our paths cross again. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.